E tuwhera ana ngā ngākau katoa ki a koe. E mohiotia ana ngā hiahia katoa. E kore hoki e ngaro i a koe te mea huna. Whakahangia iho tau wairua tapu. Hei whakamā i ngā whakaro o mātou ngāko. Kia tino aroha e mātou, kia e koe. Kia tika ai te whakanui i tō ingoa tapu. Ko i hukaraiti hoki tō mātou ariki. Āmene. A reading from the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 12, and beginning at verse 1. So the Lord sent Nathan the prophet to tell David this story. There were two men in a certain town. One was rich and one was poor. The rich man owned a great many sheep and cattle. The poor man owned nothing but one little lamb he had bought. He raised that little lamb, and it grew up with his children. It ate from the man's own plate and drank from his cup. He cuddled it in his arms like a baby daughter. One day a guest arrived at the home of the rich man, but instead of killing an animal from his own flock or herd, he took the poor man's lamb and killed it and prepared it for his guest. David was furious. As surely as the Lord lives, he vowed, any man who would do such a thing deserves to die. He must repay 4 lambs to the man for the one he stole and for having no pity. Then Nathan said to David, "You are that man. The Lord, the God of Israel, says, I anointed you king of Israel and saved you from the power of Saul. I gave you your master's house and his wives and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And if that had not been enough, I would have given you much, much more. Why then have you despised the word of the Lord and done this horrible deed? For you have murdered Uriah the Hittite with the sword of the Ammonites and stolen his wife. From this time on your family will live by the sword, because you have despised me by taking Uriah's wife to be your own. This is what the Lord says, because of what you have done, I will cause your own household to rebel against you. I will give your wives to another man before your very eyes, and he will go to bed with them in public view. You did it secretly, but I will make this happen to you openly in the sight of all Israel." Then David confessed to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan replied, "Yes, but the Lord has forgiven you, and you won't die for this sin. Nevertheless, because you have shown utter contempt for the word of the Lord, by doing this, your child will die." After Nathan returned to his home, the Lord sent a deadly illness to the child of David and Uriah's wife. David begged God to spare the child. He went without food and lay all night on the bare ground. The elders of his household pleaded with him to get up and eat with them, but he refused. Then on the 7th day the child died. David's advisers were afraid to tell him. He wouldn't listen to reason while the child was ill, they said. What drastic thing will he do when we tell him the child is dead? When David saw them whispering, he realized what had happened. "Is the child dead?" he asked. "Yes," they replied, "he is dead." Then David got up from the ground, washed himself, put on lotions, and changed his clothes. He went to the tabernacle and worshipped the Lord. After that he returned to the palace and was served food and ate. His advisers were amazed. "We don't understand you," they told him. "While the child was still living, you wept and refused to eat, but now that the child is dead, you have stopped your mourning and are eating again." David replied, "I fasted and wept while the child was alive, for I said, perhaps the Lord will be gracious to me and let the child live. But why should I fast when he is dead? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him one day, but he cannot return to me." Then David comforted Bathsheba, his wife, and slept with her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son, and David named him Solomon. The Lord loved the child and sent word through Nathan the prophet that they should name him Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord, as the Lord had commanded. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Thanks be to God. Well, this is one of the more puzzling and shocking passages that you'll find in the Old Testament. It leaves us puzzled because we cannot understand God's actions in here. And there's been vast amounts written on this, and I won't try and dig into it too much, except that in some ways I do think the writers of this passage were perceptive in a way that we in modern times are sometimes not. because they recognise that actually everything that happens is in some sense under God's control. I think sometimes we try to find a way out of the moral challenge of an omnipotent God, an all-powerful God, by maybe arguing that there are certain things outside his control. Whereas the writers of the Old Testament and the New Testament seem very content to confront that disturbing thought head on. Nevertheless, I don't want to focus on the confusing aspect of this chapter. Instead, I just want to take a moment to think about how Nathan confronts sin here. Because in David's response to the parable that Nathan tells, we see one way to respond to the story of somebody doing wrong. We see a response of judgment. He says, this is a judicial thing. This man should be punished for what he's done. The fictional character in Nathan's parable David's talking about. And it's also a moral argument that says, look, this guy, I should get angry about this other person who's doing such a terrible thing. Look, I look at them and I see they are wrong. I can see it very clearly in them. And both of these open up to us a way of engaging when we do see wrongdoing among those whom we know, that is both very wise, but also avoids giving up entirely on the possibility of change and transformation. Because I think often actually in our time and in the church culture that we're in, we're probably a little bit more prone to not bothering to talk about the issue at all. When we see people who are engaging in romantic relationships outside of marriage, sexual relationships outside of marriage, when we see people doing something harmful to others, maybe not murdering them, as Nathan does with Uriah the Hittite, but when we see those things, often it's easier for us just to keep quiet. We think, well, we have so few people in our churches, how could we possibly confront these things, which after all are very common? I mean, Nathan must have thought the same. What do kings do? Kings sleep around. And perhaps these days we look around at our society and we say, what do young people do? Well, they sleep, or even people our own age. And what we see in Nathan here is a refusal to compromise, but a way of approaching it that wins David around to see that the sword that David wishes to wield in judgment is one that's pointed towards his own conscience. He tells the story in such a way that David is disarmed. To be a prophet, of course, and to confront evil, especially in those who are in power, is a very dangerous and risky business. For example, if you had a look at, say, President Putin or maybe President Trump, and you wish to confront them about some of the things they're doing, I can't say that from practical level I would recommend this course of action to you. They might not be so keen to hear your thoughts about their moral character and leadership of their country. Nathan was in the same situation here. And so what he does is he finds a way to tell a story that is a very evocative one, and as a consequence, David's potential opposition is completely disarmed. Now, we have to say, by the way, that it's not obvious that David really understands in every aspect his wrongdoing. He seems to have very little concern for Bathsheba and the way that he's wronged her. He does nothing, as far as we can see, to make up to Uriah's family what he's done to them. And in Psalm 51, which is closely associated with this, if that was in fact written by David in response to this, then it shows a complete lack of understanding of the way that he's sinned against other people as well as against God. In Psalm 51, David is said to have proclaimed himself, "Against you and you only, Lord, have I sinned." And of course it's obvious in this story that it wasn't only against God. Nevertheless, as always, we can look at David and see how he could have been better. The point of this story is so that we look at ourselves and see how easy it is for us to sit in judgment on David even, without recognizing our own failures and faults. So this story invites us to do two things. One is, puzzling as it is to understand God's actions here, we ought to recognize that we who are part of the church and like David are close to God, are those who ought to be most aware of the kindness that's been shown to us. In the story here, there's this, God says through Nathan to David, you've been given so much and you could have asked for more. Why would you go and take what's not yours? Well, in Amazing Grace, which I referred to a few days ago, there's a line that says, it was grace that taught my heart to fear. Now, I think we've lost that idea of being close to God, of proximity to God, bringing with it actually the risk of offending him. And however we interpret this story, however we understand God's actions, it's clear that one message here was to say that to encounter grace brings with it a risk if we reject that grace and show contempt for it. So for those of us within the church, our job is not first and foremost to look at the outside world, the secular world, and call down judgment upon it. Instead, we're to look at ourselves and hold ourselves to a far higher standard within the church than the standard that we are tempted to apply to those who do not already belong to us. And if we are guilty of not looking at ourselves with the clarity that we apply to the outside world, then we ought to be afraid of the judgment we call on ourselves. And then secondly, we ought to find in here a model of how a faithful prophet might speak into these situations. And of course, it's a faithfulness of the prophet Nathan that we see in the life of Jesus as well. He often approaches people with questions. He approaches them in a way that disarms them. And we ought to find the same ways of interacting with those whose sin we must not overlook and which needs to be confronted. Therefore, it takes careful thought. It's not enough to just rock up to somebody and say, you're wrong. Instead, we need to find a way to relate to them so that they're brought from darkness to light. If we can see their darkness, how much effort ought we to put in to winning them over to the light? And by the way, just ignoring the darkness is to leave people where they are. That's a terrible thing to do as well. But in the church, often what we failed to do in the past is to approach with the grace and shrewdness that Nathan does. These days, perhaps we're tempted simply to leave people where they are. Neither of those is the right thing to do. It's not what Nathan did, and it's not what Jesus did. And of course, as soon as we start thinking of Jesus, we see too somebody who was the perfect prophet and who, unlike David, was the perfect king, who never harmed others and who was able to act as a gracious and gentle king instead of a brutalizing king. I runga I te ingoa o te matua te tama me te wairua tapu. Amen. Let's continue in prayer and ask God for the strength to act in the prophetic spirit that Nathan did there, to bring good in this world and in our church in particular, with the collect for strength. Kia inoi tātou. E hoa e tō mātou matua I te rangi, ko koe te atua kārawa oro tonu. Nau mātou I whakaora a taia noatia te tīmatanga o tēnei rā. Māu mātamea kaha, mātou e tiaki ai nei, kau hoki mātou e tukua kia taka I tēnei rā ki ta hara. Kia rere rānei ki roto ki te mate, engari tohutongia, whakatikaia e koe a mātou mahi katoa, kia mea tono ai mātou I ngā mea I tika ana ki tō titiro, ko I hukarai tēnei hoki tō mātou ariki. Āmine. And we conclude by saying together the grace. Kia tau kia tātou katoa te atawhai o tō tātou ariki o I hukarai ti. Me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhi ngā tahitanga ki te wairua tapu. Ake. Āmine. Kia ora tātou.